8 million years before the worst extinction in the history of this planet, the world had already died once, and almost no one remembers it. Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Tonight, there is nothing you need to do, nothing to solve, nothing to hold on to, nothing to keep awake for. You can let your eyes close whenever they want to. The story will keep going on its own, slow and patient, the way deep time itself moves, and you can drift down into it like settling into water that's exactly the right temperature. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been all day. Let the weight of your head rest fully into the pillow. We are going somewhere very old and very quiet, somewhere buried under hundreds of millions of years of stone, and the only thing you have to do is let yourself sink. So, 8 million years before the worst extinction that ever happened, the world had already ended once. Sit with that for a moment gently. You may have heard somewhere of the Great Dying. It's the one event most people half remember from a documentary or a textbook, the catastrophe at the end of the Permian period, the worst mass extinction the Earth has ever suffered, when something like 9 in 10 species in the ocean simply ceased to be. That's the famous one. That's the headline. But here is the thing the headlines almost never tell you. Before that great dying, 8 million years before it, in the same long stretch of deep time, the world had already convulsed and lost a vast portion of its living things in a separate catastrophe entirely, a full mass extinction of its own. And it sits there in the rocks just below the famous one, almost completely forgotten. It even has a name, though it's a name you've probably never heard spoken aloud: the Capitanian extinction. Some scientists call it the end Guadalupian event, after the slice of geological time it closes. And it is the perfect place to begin because it tells you right at the start the secret this whole long night is built around. Because here is the strange truth: the Earth has ended worlds far more often than the textbooks ever taught us. There were not 5 great catastrophes in the history of life. There were many more. And tonight, slowly, one calm entry at a time, we are going to walk through 7 of the ones that history forgot. 7 extinction pulses that quietly reshuffled life on this planet, that science itself only learned to recognize in recent decades, and that almost no one outside a few laboratories has ever heard named. Nobody learned them in school, nobody put them on the poster next to the dinosaur and the asteroid, and for the longest time, even the scientists couldn't quite see them because they were hidden, overwritten by bigger disasters, or defined too late to make it into the books, or buried so deep in the fossil record that it took a century of careful reading to even notice they were there. That's what we mean tonight when we say history forgot them. Not that the Earth forgot. The Earth keeps perfect records, written in stone, layer upon layer. It's that we never learned to read those particular pages until it was too late to fit them into the story we'd already decided to tell. So tonight, we're going to read them. The End Botomian, the Lau and the Mulder events, the Kelwasser crisis, the Capitanian, where we'll begin, the Carnian pluvial event, the Toisian, and, right at the end, an event with an old and beautiful French name, the Grande Coupure, the Great Cut, named more than 100 years ago and forgotten ever since. 7 half-remembered catastrophes, each one a world that ended and, in ending, made room for something new. Before we go down, though, I'd love to know where you are listening from tonight. If you feel like it, leave a word in the comments. Just the place, the country, the city, wherever you are, as you let yourself drift off. There's something quietly lovely about a room full of strangers all over the world settling into the same old story at the same time in the dark. And if you're new here and you'd like more of these slow, calm journeys into deep time, you're welcome to subscribe and stay a while. But there's no hurry. There's never any hurry here. You can do that tomorrow or never. Tonight is only for resting. Now, Let's go down. Before we step into that first forgotten world, it helps to understand a little of how any of this is known at all. How anyone could possibly stand here hundreds of millions of years later and say with any confidence that on a particular ancient afternoon, in a particular ancient sea, life suffered a catastrophe. It seems almost impossible, doesn't it? The events we're talking about happened so long ago that the very continents had not yet arranged themselves into the shapes you'd recognize on a map. And yet we can speak about them. We can name them. We can argue about what killed them. How? The answer is the rock itself and the tiny things buried in it. For most of the history of life, the great majority of living things left no trace at all when they died. Soft bodies rot, skin and flesh and leaf and feather dissolve back into the world and leave nothing behind. But some creatures wore their hardness on the outside. Shells, skeletons of mineral, tiny cups and plates and tooth-like fragments made of calcium and other minerals that could survive being buried, pressed, and turned slowly to stone. And of all the places on Earth where such hard parts gathered and were preserved, none was richer than the floor of the shallow sea. Imagine, for a moment, the gentlest possible scene. A warm, shallow sea, somewhere in the deep past. On its floor, generation after generation of small, shelled animals live and die and settle down into the soft mud, layer over layer over layer, year after year, for millions of years, until the whole record of an entire world of living things is laid down in the seafloor like the pages of a book being written from the bottom up. That is the marine fossil record. And because seafloor animals fossilize so abundantly and so continuously, their record is the most complete and unbroken account of life that the planet keeps. So when paleontologists want to know whether a catastrophe happened, this is where they look. They read upward through the stone, layer by layer, watching which creatures are present, how many kinds, how abundant. And when they find a place in the rock where suddenly a great many kinds of creatures that had been there for ages simply vanish from the record all at once, where the diversity collapses in what is, by the standards of deep time, the blink of an eye, that absence, that sudden silence in the stone is what they call an extinction pulse, a gap where a world used to be. That's all an extinction really is in the rock. A disappearance, a page where the names that filled the page before it are suddenly gone. Now there's a particular threshold that earns an event the heavy title of mass extinction. By convention, scientists tend to reserve those words for the very worst of the worst, for a loss of roughly more than 3/4 of all the species on Earth in a geologically short span of time. More than 75% gone. That is an almost unimaginable scale of loss, and only a handful of events in the whole long history of life ever crossed that line. Those few were given a name, collectively, in the early 1980s. In 1982, two American scientists, Jack Sepkoski and David Raup, sat down with an enormous compilation of the marine fossil record and measured, as carefully as anyone ever had, the rise and fall of life's diversity through time. And out of all that data, 5 great catastrophes stood out above the rest. 5 moments when the curve of life plunged off a cliff. The end Ordovician, the late Devonian, the end Permian, that worst of all great dying, the end Triassic, and the end Cretaceous, the famous one, the one with the asteroid, and the end of the dinosaurs. Those 5 became known as the Big Five, and once a thing has a clean, memorable name and a tidy count, it tends to crowd out everything around it. The Big Five went into the textbooks, they went on to the posters, they became the story. 5 great catastrophes, neatly numbered, the whole drama of extinction reduced to a list you could memorize. But here is the gentle, important thing to understand as you lie there in the dark. That number 5 was never the whole truth. It was a threshold drawn for convenience, a line in the sand that said these are the very biggest. It was never meant to suggest that nothing else ever happened. And in the decades since 1982, as scientists kept reading the rock with finer and finer attention, they kept finding more, smaller crises that still tore through whole groups of living things, pulses that fell just below that 75% line, but still emptied out the reefs, still erased whole families of creatures, still reorganized the living world from the sea floor up. Many of these events were only recognized as distinct catastrophes in recent decades. Some weren't named or measured or even noticed as separate things until the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, long after the canon of the Big Five had already hardened into the version of the story everyone learned. And that truly is why history forgot them. Not because they were small, some of them were enormous, but because they were defined after the textbooks had already been printed, after the posters had already been hung, after everyone had already agreed that the answer was 5. Science didn't forget them. The public simply never got to learn them in the first place. And there's one more thread I want to lay gently into your hands before we descend into the first of these forgotten worlds, because it runs through nearly all of them. And once you've seen it, you'll feel it returning again and again through the long night ahead, like a figure glimpsed in the distance at the end of each chapter. When most people picture an extinction, they picture the asteroid, the flash, the impact, the sky turning to fire, the sudden death from above that ended the dinosaurs. And that did happen once at the end of the Cretaceous. But it turns out that the asteroid is the exception, not the rule. The villain that returns over and over through these forgotten catastrophes is something far slower, far quieter, and far stranger. It isn't a rock from space, it's the planet itself gone to extremes. Again and again, when scientists trace these events back to a cause, they find the same kind of culprit. Vast outpourings of volcanic rock, but not a single volcano, but enormous regions of the Earth's crust splitting open and bleeding lava across whole landscapes over tens of thousands of years. Geologists call these enormous volcanic events large igneous provinces, and it isn't really the lava that does the killing, it's the breath of those eruptions. As all that molten rock pours out, it exhales carbon dioxide and sulfur into the air on a scale that dwarfs anything alive. The carbon dioxide warms the planet. The warming changes the chemistry of the sea. The sea grows acidic, and worse, it begins to lose its oxygen. Vast regions of ocean turning still and stagnant and breathless until the creatures living there simply suffocate. Volcanoes breathing carbon, oceans losing their oxygen, a world warming and souring and slowly running out of breath. That is the recurring shape of catastrophe in deep time. Not a sudden blow, but a slow strangulation carried out by the planet's own geology. Hold that shape loosely in your mind as you drift. You'll see it return. And now, at last, we go down into the first forgotten world. The world that died twice. Picture the Earth as it was roughly 260 million years ago, in the middle of the Permian period, in the long stretch of time geologists call the Guadalupian. The continents have crowded together into one vast supercontinent. The seas are warm and shallow around its edges, and those shallow seas are crowded with life. A whole flourishing world of shelled and reef-building creatures going about the slow business of living and dying and laying down their hard parts in the mud, exactly as they had for tens of millions of years. And then, into that warm and crowded world, came the eruptions. In what is today the southwestern part of China, across the regions we now call Sichuan and Yunnan, the crust of the Earth opened and a large igneous province poured itself out across the land. Geologists call those ancient lava flows the Amatian traps. And what makes them so telling, so persuasive, is where they sit in the rock. When you read upward through the layers of stone from this time, you find the extinction horizon, that sudden silence where so many creatures vanish, woven right in among the layers of volcanic rock, the eruptions and the dying interleaved, stacked together in the stone like two stories being told at once. The timing points its quiet finger. As the Amatian traps erupted, the world began to die. And who did the dying? This is one of the loveliest, strangest parts of any of these old catastrophes. The chance to meet, for a moment, the creatures that filled a vanished world. Among the greatest casualties of the Capitanian were the giants of the small. There lived in those warm Permian seas single-celled organisms called fusulinid foraminifera. Now, foraminifera, as a rule, are tiny, microscopic specks of life, a single cell building itself a delicate mineral shell. But these particular ones, the fusulinids of the Permian, had done something remarkable. They had grown large. Some of them swelled to the size of a grain of rice, even larger, centimeters across. A single living cell you could have held between two fingers, shaped like a tiny grain or a little spindle, drifting and settling across the warm seafloor in untold numbers. They were one of the signature life forms of that age. And the Capitanian extinction cut them down. The giant fusulinids, those improbable, beautiful single cells grown vast, were among the heaviest losses of the event. And they were not alone. The crisis tore through the reef and shallow water communities of the time. Brachiopods, small shelled creatures that look, to a casual eye, rather like clams, though they're built on an entirely different plan, anchored to the seafloor, filtering the water, fell in great numbers. Corals, the patient reef builders, suffered. Large bivalves, the true clams and their relatives, were hit. Whole communities of the shallow sea, the dense, crowded living architecture of that warm Permian world, thinned and emptied and collapsed. What exactly the planet did to them in those eruptions is still being worked out, and here the honest scientist has to hold the story a little loosely. There are signs in the rock of a strange climatic whiplash, hints of cooling, even of ice, alongside the warming you'd expect from all that volcanic carbon, as though the eruptions first chilled the world and then heated it, or as though the climate lurched one way and then violently the other. This part remains genuinely debated, the evidence pulling in more than one direction, and it would be dishonest to tie it up too neatly. But the broad shape is clear enough. The Amatian eruptions disrupted the climate and the chemistry of the sea, and the living world of the Middle Permian paid for it with one of the great, forgotten extinctions of all time. And now we come to the real reason this catastrophe slipped so completely out of human memory. The reason it deserves, more than any of the others, to be called the world that history forgot. It was overwritten, because just 8 million years later, and in deep time, 8 million years is barely a breath, a single thin set of pages in that great stone book, the Permian world suffered the second of its 2 deaths. The end, Permian Great Dying, the worst extinction the Earth has ever known, came rolling through and erased so much, so violently, that it nearly wiped the slate clean. And when later scientists looked back at the rocks of the Permian, the sheer scale of that final catastrophe loomed so large that the earlier one, the Capitanian, was almost lost in its shadow. The 2 events sat so close together in the stone that for a long time they were blurred into one, the smaller blow swallowed up in the memory of the larger. It took careful, patient work to pull them apart. It was really only in the 1990s and the years that followed that scientists managed to clearly separate the Capitanian out as its own distinct crisis. A full catastrophe in its own right, not merely the opening tremor of the Great Dying, but a separate ending with its own causes and its own casualties 8 million years before. In 1994, the researchers Stanley and Yang made the case that here, in the Middle Permian, was a mass extinction that history had merged into its larger neighbor and very nearly lost. And so it became, for us, the perfect first entry. A world that ended and then ended again. A catastrophe so completely overshadowed by the one that followed it that for the better part of a century, hardly anyone knew it had happened at all. The Permian didn't die once, it died twice. And the first death, the giant single cells settling silent into the mud, the reefs going quiet, the Amatian lava cooling in the dark, is one almost no one has ever heard of. That's how it works, this forgetting. Not malice, not mystery. Just a louder catastrophe standing in front of a quieter one until the quieter one disappears from view entirely, waiting patiently in the rock for someone to read far enough back to find it. Rest there for a moment in that ancient warm sea with the giant fusulinids drifting down through the still water and the eruptions glowing somewhere far away on the supercontinent's edge. There's no alarm in it now, it's all so very long ago, so completely finished and at peace. The Capitanian world ended 250 million years before there was anyone here to mourn it, and the loss has long since settled into the calm of deep time, the way everything does eventually. And out of that ending, as out of every ending we'll visit tonight, the world went on. The survivors of the Capitanian, the creatures that slipped through, that endured the eruptions and the changing seas, carried life forward into the next chapter, even into the teeth of the great dying that was still to come. Something always comes through. That is the quiet promise woven through all 7 of these forgotten catastrophes, and it's worth holding on to as you sink deeper towards sleep. Every ending we'll visit was also, somewhere, a beginning. But the Capitanian, as old as it is not the oldest forgotten world we'll walk through tonight. There is an extinction far deeper still, one that struck not in the crowded Permian seas, but at the very dawn of complex life, while the living world was still in the act of inventing itself, while the first animals were only just learning how to build their bodies and their reefs. To reach it, we have to travel back more than twice as far, to a time so ancient that even the Capitanian would seem young by comparison. We have to go back to the Cambrian, to the great explosion of life, and to the strange and forgotten setback that interrupted it. And that is where we'll go next, slowly, gently, in just a moment. There's no need to follow every thread. If you've already begun to drift, let yourself. The story will still be here, patient as the stone, carrying you down into deeper and older time. Let it move at its own slow pace. The first reefs the world ever built are waiting for us far below, in a sea older than almost anything you can imagine. And we have all night to find them. Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Before we go any further down, before the next sea opens beneath us, let's pause for a moment in the quiet and get our bearings, because the path we're walking tonight is an unfamiliar one, and it helps to know how the ground beneath it was mapped. You have probably heard, at some point, of the great extinctions. There are 5 of them in the textbooks, 5 moments when the living world was nearly emptied and had to begin again. Scientists call them the Big Five, and they were given that name in 1982 in a single careful study by 2 paleontologists, David Raup and Jack Sepkoski, who sat down with the marine fossil record and counted the end Ordovician, the late Devonian, the end Permian, the great dying we've already touched tonight, the end Triassic, And the end Cretaceous, the one with the asteroid and the dinosaurs, the only one most people ever really learn. 5 great endings, canonized, named, remembered. But a mass extinction in the strict and careful sense means something specific. It means the loss of more than 3/4 of all species in a sliver of geological time, a blink in the long life of the planet. And the trouble with a definition that strict is that it draws a hard line through a world that was never really divided by hard lines. Below that line of 75%, there were dozens of smaller events, smaller pulses, crises that fell short of the threshold and yet still reached into the living world and rearranged it. They didn't quite qualify. They didn't make the famous list. And so they slipped quietly out of memory, That's the first thing worth understanding as we descend. When we say history forgot these extinctions, we don't quite mean that. Science didn't forget them. Science, in fact, only recently learned to see them at all. Many of the 7 we'll visit tonight were not named, not measured, not separated out from the noise of deep time until the 1980s, the 90s, even the 2000s. They were defined after the textbooks were already written, after the canon was already set. The public never learned them because by the time the rocks gave them up, the story everyone had already been taught had closed its doors. That is the truest meaning of forgotten here. Not lost. Just never widely told. And how do you find an extinction that happened 250 million years ago with no witnesses, no records, nothing but stone? You read the sea floor, the animals that lived on the bottom of the ancient oceans, the shelled, the calcified, the small and abundant, left their bodies behind in vast numbers, layer upon layer, a slow rain of life settling into mud that would one day become rock. When you walk upward through those layers, through the patient stack of time, you can watch the creatures come and go. You can see a kind of shell appear, flourish, fill the record for 10 million years, and then, in the space of a few centimeters of stone, simply stop. A gap, a silence, a sudden absence where there was abundance. That silence in the rock is how a pulse is detected. That is what an extinction looks like when you hold it in your hands. And here is the thread I'd like you to carry down with you, the quiet pattern beneath all of it. When you imagine an extinction, you probably imagine the asteroid, the fire from the sky, the sudden cataclysm. But that is the exception, not the rule. Again and again across these forgotten worlds, the villain was not a visitor from space at all. It was the planet itself, the ordinary machinery of geology pushed to an extreme. Enormous volcanic regions, the ones geologists call large igneous provinces, would open up and breathe out carbon and sulfur for tens of thousands of years at a stretch. The air would warm, the seas would turn acid, and the oxygen would slowly leak out of the water until the oceans themselves could no longer support the life within them. Volcanoes breathing carbon, oceans losing their breath. You'll meet that same slow killer over and over tonight, wearing different names in different ages, and after a while you'll begin to recognize it, the way you recognize a face you've seen before in a dream. So now, with all of that beneath us, let's return to the Capitanian. And let me show you what it actually was, because we've spoken of its mystery, but not yet of its losses. It happened around 260 million years ago, in the Middle Permian, in the part of that period geologists call the Guadalupian. And its prime suspect, the great suspect that fits the pattern we've just named, lies in what is now southwestern China, in the provinces of Sichuan and Yunnan. There, the rocks preserve the remains of an enormous volcanic outpouring called the Emetian Traps. Layer upon layer of ancient lava, hardened now into dark and silent stone, stacked into the landscape. And when geologists trace those eruption layers and lay them against the extinction horizon in the rock, the two are interleaved. The lavas and the dying are woven together in the same pages of stone. The volcano and the silence, side by side, Picture the world that was lost. The shallow Permian seas were warm and crowded, and among their most extraordinary inhabitants were the fusulinids, single-celled creatures, foraminifera, no more than specks of life by their nature, and yet some of them had grown to the size of a grain of rice, even a small bean. Imagine that. A single cell grown large enough to hold between your fingers, building an intricate coiled shell like a miniature architecture. They drifted and rested in the warm shallows by the countless billion, so numerous that their shells today make up whole beds of limestone. And in the Capitanian, the largest of them, the giants, were swept away. They were not alone. The great brachiopods, the lamp shells that anchored to the ancient seafloor and filtered the water for their living. The corals that built the reefs. The large bivalves of the shallows. The Capitanian reached into the warm, productive, shallow seas, into exactly the places where life had grown most extravagant and most exposed, and it thinned them out. The reef world, that bright and complex architecture of the Permian shallows, was diminished long before the Great Dying ever arrived to finish the work. What drove it beyond the volcanoes is harder to say, and here the honest answer is that the scientists themselves are still arguing. There are hints in the rock of a cooling, a chill, even a touch of ice at one moment. And there are hints of warming too, the kind of warming you would expect from a volcano breathing carbon into the sky. It may be that both happened, that the Capitanian world lurched from cold to hot, a climate whiplash, the seas swinging through states no living thing was built to follow. That picture is contested, still being weighed, still being read out of the stone. And there is a kind of comfort in that uncertainty, a reminder that the deep past does not give up its secrets all at once, that even now there are careful people leaning over these ancient rocks, asking the seas to tell them a little more. And so we move further back, much further back, away from the Permian, away from the world of coral and shell and vertebrate spine, back into a time so remote that the very concept of a reef had only just been invented. Back to a moment when life was still, in a very real sense, working out how to be. Around 517 million years ago, give or take a few million years, the planet was in the middle of what we now call the Cambrian explosion. That name is a little misleading because it was not an explosion in any dramatic sense. It was not sudden on any human scale. It was more like a long, slow flowering, a time when the oceans were filling up with shapes and architectures of living things that had never existed before. Animals with eyes, with shells, with jointed limbs, with the first soft hints of a skeleton. Life had existed for hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian, but it had been largely invisible, largely soft, largely formless, in the way that a dream is formless. The Cambrian was the moment when life began to build itself into recognizable things, and it is remembered almost entirely for that building, for the flowering, the burst of invention, the staggering variety of body plans that appears in those ancient rocks. What almost nobody remembers is that in the middle of that flowering, something came and cut the stems. The event is called the End Batomian extinction, or sometimes the Batomian-Toyonian crisis, names drawn from the names of the rock stages in which it is recorded. It happened during the early part of the Cambrian, while the great diversification was still underway. Life was not done inventing itself. The catalogue of forms was still being written, and yet something moved through those Cambrian oceans and erased great portions of what had already been written. The principal victims were the archaeocyathids. That word, archaeocyathids, sounds technical and cold, and it is easy to let it slide past you, but hold it for a moment, because these were something extraordinary. They were the first reef builders in the history of life on Earth. Before them, reefs did not exist. The solid, three-dimensional architecture of an underwater reef built upward from the seafloor into the light, assembled from the slow, calcified bodies of living organisms. That invention belonged to the archaeocyathids. They were shaped something like cups or chalices, open at the top, their bodies calcified into hard, porous structures that stacked and clustered and grew upon each other in the shallow, sunlit waters of the early Cambrian Sea. If you could have dove into those ancient shallows and looked down, you would have seen something not entirely unlike a coral reef, though the architects would have been entirely alien to you, like nothing alive today. They had been building those reefs across the shallow margins of the Cambrian world, perhaps for 20 or 30 million years, a breathtaking span of time by any measure. They were the engineers of the early ocean, the first organisms to construct habitat on a grand scale, to build a living architecture that other creatures could shelter within and feed from. And then, during the end-Batonian crisis, they were largely gone. The word largely is doing careful work in that sentence. Not every archaeocyatid perished. The extinction was not so clean as that, but the great reef-building communities they had assembled, the complex three-dimensional structures that had been growing in the warm Cambrian shallows, those collapsed. Reefs of comparable scale and complexity would not be rebuilt in the world's oceans for millions of years afterward. The first great reef world ended in the middle of the Cambrian, at a moment when the story of life had barely begun, and the sea floor in those places was left for a long time, simpler and quieter and emptier than it had been. Trilobites also fared badly across this boundary, across what geologists reading the rock in Siberia and South China and other places see as the transition from the Batonian into the Toyonian stage. Many early trilobite groups that had been present, that had crawled along the Cambrian seafloor and filtered its sediment and hunted its soft-bodied prey, simply do not appear in the rocks above a certain layer. They crossed a threshold and did not come back. The faunas that follow, the trilobite communities of the later Cambrian, are different assemblages rebuilt from what survived and from new lineages that arose after the crisis had passed. It is worth pausing to think about what it means for an extinction to happen in the middle of the Cambrian. We have a tendency, when we think about the history of life, to think of the Cambrian as a kind of prologue, as if the world was simply gearing up before the real story began. But the archaeocyathids who built those reefs were not a rehearsal. Their reefs were not practice runs. They were the genuine article, the real thing, ecosystems as complex and as alive as anything that came after them. And the animals that lived among them were as fully, as completely alive as you are. When the end-Batonian crisis moved through those waters, it was not clearing away a rough draft, it was erasing something finished. What caused it? Here, as so often with these ancient and obscure events, the honest answer is we are not entirely sure. The leading hypothesis involves widespread ocean anoxia, the familiar term we met with the Capitanian, those stretches of ocean where the oxygen drains away and the water becomes hostile to any animal that breathes it. The same invisible mechanism, the same suffocation of the sea. There is also a candidate volcanic culprit, as there will be again and again throughout this story. The Kalkarinji large igneous province, preserved now in what is northern Australia, a vast outpouring of volcanic rock that represents one of those episodes of catastrophic, long-sustained volcanism that the planet periodically generates. Its age has been estimated at around 510 to 511 million years, which places it in the general neighborhood of the end-Batonian crisis. Close enough to be interesting, but the precise relationship between the two, whether the volcanic eruptions drove the extinctions or merely coincided with them, is still being worked out. The timing is contested, the correlation is suggestive, but the deep past requires a certain tolerance for ambiguity, and here the ambiguity is genuine. What is not ambiguous is the scale of the loss. The end Batonian is, by most accounts, the oldest event commonly proposed as a full mass extinction. It sits at the very beginning of the record of complex animal life, at the dawn of the era when hard shells and calcified skeletons began to be preserved in the rock in any number, meaning the event itself is both ancient and difficult to read clearly. The signal is muffled by time, by the imperfect fossilization of Cambrian animals, by the sparse and fragmentary nature of the record from that remote an age. And so it sits near the beginning of this list and near the edge of what the fossil record can clearly tell us, which is in a way part of why it has been forgotten. The public memory of the Cambrian is the explosion, the flowering, the riot of invention. The crisis in the middle of that flowering is a quieter story, harder to see in the rock, harder to tell without the careful technical vocabulary of the specialist. It requires knowing what an archaeocyathid is and caring that it built the world's first reef and understanding what was lost when those reefs collapsed. But now you know. And that name, which sounded cold and strange a few minutes ago, carries something warmer now. The memory of an architecture that life spent 20 or 30 million years building, and then, in the middle of a moment of tremendous creative flourishing, lost. The Earth moved on. The trilobites that survived diversified into new forms. The seafloor slowly refilled. And in the long aftermath of that Cambrian crisis, life did what it has always done. It rebuilt, changed, and continued, though never in quite the same shape as before. The archaeocyathid reef world was gone for good. What came after was different. Not lesser, necessarily, but different. The world had been remade as it would be remade again in the much quieter period that followed. Because the Silurian, the period that comes after the Ordovician and before the Devonian, somewhere between about 440 and 420 million years ago, has a reputation. It is sometimes described as the great calm of early animal life, a warm greenhouse interlude when the seas were shallow and balmy and the world settled into a long, mild tenure. The Ordovician had ended in glaciers and mass extinction. The Devonian would bring its own catastrophes, but the Silurian, sandwiched between them, is often portrayed as a kind of pastoral interlude, a long, slow afternoon in the history of life. And for a long time, the textbooks left it that way. The textbooks were wrong. What the careful examination of the rock record, particularly the record of carbon isotopes, the chemical fingerprint left in ancient limestone and organic material, has revealed in the last few decades is that the Silurian was not calm at all. It convulsed, twice at least, in ways that left visible and dramatic scars in the rock. Events that shook the marine world, that wiped out groups of organisms that had been among the most successful in the early Silurian seas, and that were only named and recognized as distinct extinction crises relatively recently. In the work of researchers like Mikael Kallner and Lennart Jepsen, who patiently read the chemical record of those ancient limestones. Events that most of the public has still never heard of. Two of them close in time, separated by only a few million years, one called the Mulder event and one called the Lau event. The Mulder event sits in what geologists call the Homerian stage, at around 427 million years ago. The Lau event is younger by a few million years in the Ludfordian stage, at around 424 million years ago. 3 million years is not very long in deep time, and these two crises, though distinct, are part of a broader pattern of instability in the middle and late Silurian, a period when the planet's carbon cycle was swinging back and forth in ways that had severe consequences for life in the sea. The organisms that suffered most were two of the most characteristic groups of Silurian life. The first were the graptolites. That name, too, may need a moment of introduction. Graptolites were colonial animals each colony consisting of many tiny individual animals living in small cups arranged along a shared organic structure, something like a delicate branching or linear twig made of chitin, the same material as an insect's exoskeleton, drifting through the water column, floating in the open ocean. Their fossils look like pencil marks on the rock, which is why they were named from the Greek for written stone. They are the signature fossils of the early Paleozoic seas, found in huge numbers in certain kinds of dark, fine-grained shale, the remains of oceans where their drifting colonies fell to the seafloor in their countless millions. For much of the Ordovician and the Silurian, graptolites were among the most abundant and widely distributed animals in the ocean. The Mulde event is sometimes called the Big Crisis for graptolites. That name captures something important. The Mulde event did not merely trouble the graptolites, it fundamentally disrupted them. Many graptolite species that had persisted through the early Silurian did not survive the Mulde crisis. The colony forms, the shapes, the varieties that had characterized those earlier seas were thinned out severely. What came after, the graptolite faunas of the post-Mulde world, were different assemblages reduced in variety, rebuilt from the survivors. The conodonts suffered too. Conodonts are even harder to picture than graptolites because the only part of them that fossilizes reliably is their teeth. Tiny, comb-like structures of calcium phosphate, often just a millimeter or two in length, found in sediment by the hundreds of thousands when you process the right kind of rock. The animal they belonged to was eel-like and soft-bodied, swimming through the water column, a jawless vertebrate, meaning a relative, however distant, of everything with a backbone, including you. They were among the most abundant of early Paleozoic ocean animals, and they are among the most useful fossils for dating and correlating ancient rocks, precisely because there were so many species of them and they evolved relatively quickly. And in both the Mulde and the Lau events, conodont faunas turned over dramatically, many species disappearing and being replaced by new assemblages in the aftermath. What drove these crises is recorded in the carbon isotope record in a way that is actually quite legible if you know how to read it. Carbon comes in slightly different forms, different isotopes, and living things prefer one form over the other when they build their bodies. When you measure the ratio of these isotopes in ancient limestone or organic material, you get a chemical signature of what the ocean and atmosphere were doing at that moment. A sudden large shift in that ratio means something dramatic happened to the carbon cycle, a sudden change in how much organic carbon was being buried or how much carbon dioxide was being released into the atmosphere, or how much life was living and dying in the surface water. The Mulde and Lau events are each marked by large positive carbon isotope excursions. The isotopic signal swings sharply in a direction that indicates a significant disruption in how carbon was moving through the ocean and atmosphere. The Lau excursion in particular is among the largest positive carbon isotope excursions in the entire Silurian record, which is itself saying something, because the Silurian has some of the largest such swings in the whole of Earth's history. These are not subtle wiggles in the data, they are dramatic departures from the baseline, the chemical fingerprint of a world in serious imbalance. The precise mechanism behind these excursions is still debated. What they record, most likely, is a combination of oceanographic and climatic instability, shifts in how the ocean circulated, in whether the deep water was oxygenated or stagnant, in the balance between greenhouse warmth and moments of cooling. The Silurian ocean, in the intervals around these events, seems to have been an unstable place, prone to rapid shifts between states, between warm and oxygenated surface water and cold, stratified, oxygen-poor conditions below, between normal marine chemistry and the chemical signature of widespread anoxia spreading through the seafloor. These are not conditions that life in the sea found easy to endure, and the graptolites and conodonts, those characteristic inhabitants of the open Silurian ocean, bore the brunt of those repeated disturbances. There is a satisfaction in this overturning of the old picture. The Silurian was supposed to be the calm, the warm, stable, uneventful greenhouse world between two more dramatic chapters. And then you look more closely, you read the carbon record, you trace the turnover of graptolites and conodonts through the rock, and you find that the calm was an illusion, that the Silurian world convulsed twice, with crises serious enough to fundamentally reshape its animal communities, that the quiet interlude was never really quiet. It is one of the recurring lessons of this kind of careful paleontological work. The lesson that the apparent stillness of any given period is often just the stillness of not looking closely enough. The big five extinctions are visible even from a great distance from the very coarse resolution of introductory geology. But the Mulder event, the Lau event, the end Batonian, these require a closer look. They require someone to sit down with the carbon record or with the graptolite biostratigraphy of the Ludlow and the Homerian and ask, does something happen here? Is there a crisis in this rock? And the answer, again and again, has been yes. The world that seemed calm was, at close range, trembling. There is something else worth holding on to as we pass through these two Silurian events, and it is a pattern that has been slowly taking shape since we began in the Capitanian, a thread running through the geology of all these forgotten crises, something that will become more and more visible as we continue. You may already have noticed it dimly. It concerns the mechanism, not the who or the when, but the how, the engine that drives these events. The mechanism we have seen twice already, the ocean losing its oxygen, the chemistry of the sea swinging out of balance, the deep water going dead. Ocean anoxia. That quiet catastrophe, invisible to any casual observer, the oxygen simply draining out of vast stretches of deep water as the ocean's circulation slows, or as nutrients flood in and life blooms and dies in such quantities that the bacteria consuming those bodies use up all the available oxygen in the process. A sea that from the surface might look completely normal, still reflecting the light, still moving in its slow swells, but whose deep reaches have become a kind of chemical desert where nothing that breathes can survive. We saw it hinted at in the Capitanian. We see it suspected from the oceanographic instability in the Silurian crises. It will become unmistakable, almost luminous with clarity in the events still ahead of us. And lurking behind it in several of these events is the other recurring figure, the one we have not yet fully named, the geological process that seems to appear again and again as a precondition for these disruptions. The planet breathing carbon in quantities so large that the chemistry of the atmosphere shifts. Volcanic provinces of extraordinary scale, erupting not for days or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years, pumping carbon dioxide into the air with a patience and a relentlessness that no individual volcano could match. That pattern, carbon from below, heat at the surface, oxygen gone from the sea below, is the recurring machinery of these forgotten extinctions. It is not the asteroid, brilliant and sudden and catastrophic. It is something slower and in some ways stranger. It is the planet itself working through its own internal processes, doing what the planet does, and in doing so, reshuffling the living world in ways that took millions of years to undo. We have not fully named it yet, the story is still unfolding, but by the time we have passed through a few more of these forgotten events, the pattern will be impossible to miss, the same villain returning, patient, geological, volcanic, chemical, again and again. The quiet machine behind the mass extinction that nobody wrote down in the textbook. For now, though, we let the Silurians settle. The graptolites, or what remained of them, drifted on through the late Silurian seas, their colonies reduced in variety, The survivors of two crises adapted to whatever the post-Lau, post-Mulder ocean had become. The conodonts likewise persisted, changed, their tiny tooth-like elements accumulating in new layers of sediment above the crisis horizons, the record of a community reconstituting itself after disturbance. The Silurian would end, as all periods end, in its own good time. And what came after it would inherit a world already shaped by losses most people never knew occurred. The shallow seas of the late Silurian and early Devonian teemed with new experiments, with fish diversifying and jawless vertebrates giving way to jawed ones, with the first forests beginning to take root at the edges of the continent, low plants first, creeping across the margins of the land. Life was, once again, building towards something. The carbon in the atmosphere, the chemistry of the sea, the circulation of the ocean. All of it was moving, never still, always trending in some direction or another, accumulating toward the next threshold. But that is the next chapter of the story. And it will ask us to return to the sea, to a particular layer of black rock in a mountainside in Germany, to the question of how the most magnificent reefs the world had ever built simply ceased to be. How can a living structure that took millions of years to construct, that occupied the sunlit shallows of the ancient ocean from what is now the American Midwest to the edges of Europe, simply stop? What is the mechanism of something so vast going so quiet? And there is another question inside that one, a stranger question, the one that will make you pause when you hear it, because part of the answer, part of what brought those reefs down, according to the best hypothesis the paleontologists and geochemists have assembled, is not the volcano. It is not the ocean current. It is not even the slow withdrawal of oxygen from the deep sea, though that was certainly part of it. Part of the answer is the trees. The forests spreading across the ancient continents, pushing their deep roots into soil for the first time, breaking rock, releasing nutrients, flooding the rivers and ultimately the sea with an abundance that the ocean could not absorb without consequence. How can a plant kill an ocean? The answer is coming, but first, let the Silurian rest. Let the graptolite colonies drift in the dark, the last of their kind, in the quiet waters above a seafloor that has been through more than the textbooks ever mentioned. The rocks do not forget, even when we do. And so we move deeper into the record, down through the compressed strata of 500 million years, toward a period that most people know only as a name in a list, if they know it at all. The Cambrian explosion is one of those phrases that lodges in the mind, even if the details have faded. Life diversifying in an astonishing rush. Creatures with eyes and shells and legs appearing in the fossil record as if from nowhere after billions of years of microbial quiet. It is one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the living world, and it is almost always told as a story of arrival, of beginning, of life discovering what it could become. What that story leaves out is what happened in the middle of it. Around 517 million years ago, while the explosion was still underway, while the seas were still thick with new body plans and the shallow shelves of the ancient ocean were still being colonized by animals that had never existed before, something went wrong. The water changed, the ocean floor in many places lost its oxygen, and the first reef builders on Earth, organisms that had spent millions of years constructing something no living thing had ever constructed before, simply stopped. The archaeocyathids, the name is not a famous one, but what they built was remarkable. They were sponge-like animals, shaped rather like small cups or vases, their calcified walls perforated by pores through which the water moved, and they grew in colonies along the sunlit edges of the shallow Cambrian Sea. In doing so, they built the first reefs in the history of life on Earth, not the massive cathedral structures of the Devonian, not yet, but genuine biological frameworks, the first experiment in animals reshaping their environment into something architectural, something that other animals could live inside and underneath and around. And then, in the interval that paleontologists call the Batonian-Toyonian crisis, they were gone. Not all of them immediately, and the precise tempo is still being worked out from the rock record in Siberia and South China, where the stratigraphic evidence is clearest. But the Archaeocyanid reef world ended. Reefs of comparable scale would not be rebuilt for millions of years. The sea floor in many regions returned to something simpler. The first great experiment in biologically constructed habitat was over before most of life had even had a chance to move in. The trilobites suffered as well across this same interval. The early trilobite faunas, already fantastically varied by the standards of what had existed before, turned over heavily. Many of the earliest lineages vanished, others diminished, and were replaced by forms that came after. The shape of life in the shallow seas shifted, and while it would go on diversifying, it would do so from a different starting point than it might have reached. What caused this? The honest answer is that we are still assembling it. The leading candidates involve widespread ocean anoxia, the same mechanism, the oxygen-stripped water, and the possibility of volcanic forcing. There is a large igneous province in Australia, the Kalkarinji flood basalts, dated to somewhere around 510 to 511 million years ago. The timing is close to the end Batonian crisis, close enough to be a serious candidate for the volcanic trigger that may have driven the anoxia and the warming and the cascade that followed. But the correlation is contested. The dating of events this old carries real uncertainty, and paleontologists are careful to present it as a candidate rather than a conviction. The rocks from 5 and 17 million years ago are few, and the ones that exist have been through a great deal since they were laid down. What is not contested is that the event happened, that in the middle of the great diversification there was a setback, that the first reefs fell silent, that this is, by most measures, the oldest event commonly proposed as a mass extinction in the history of complex animal life on Earth, and that almost no one has ever heard it named. This is partly the nature of the Cambrian itself. The period lives in the popular imagination as a story of creation, not of loss. And in the long arc, that is true enough. The Cambrian did see an extraordinary flourishing, and what came through the Batonian-Toyonian crisis continued to diversify into everything that followed. But creation and catastrophe are not opposites in the history of life. They are often the same event seen from different distances. The Archaeocyanid were not replaced by nothing. The sea was not empty when the reefs fell. It was simply different, and the difference accumulated, and out of that difference came what came next. The oldest forgotten extinction then, and already the pattern is forming faintly at the edge of recognition. Ocean anoxia, a candidate volcanic province, a sudden restructuring of what had seemed like a stable world, happening not from outside the planet but from within it, from the slow geological machinery turning in ways that life, even flourishing life, could not always accommodate. Keep that pattern in mind. It will return. The Silurian period begins around 443 million years ago in the aftermath of the end Ordovician extinction. One of the big five, a genuine catastrophe involving glaciation and the rapid flooding of newly frozen coastlines as the ice retreated. The Silurian that followed has often been described as a recovery, a stabilization, a relatively quiet greenhouse interlude between two more dramatic chapters: warm, shallow seas, coral reefs re-establishing, fish diversifying, life spreading cautiously across what was still a mostly marine world. That picture is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that the rock record has only made clear in recent decades. The Silurian contains within it a series of sharp, sudden disturbances. carbon isotope excursions, anomalies in the ratio of carbon isotopes preserved in ancient carbonate rocks that record massive disruptions to the global carbon cycle, disruptions of a kind and scale that point to something serious happening to the climate and the ocean simultaneously. And braided into those chemical signals are the extinction signatures, the sudden gaps and turnovers in the fossil record of the organisms that were living when these disruptions struck. Two of these events are the most prominent: the Mulde event, in the interval geologists call the Homerian, around 427 million years ago, and the Lau event, in the Ludfordian, around 424 million years ago, 3 million years apart, each leaving its mark in the rock, each associated with one of the largest positive carbon isotope excursions in the entire fossil record. The researchers who have done the most to define and characterize these events, Lennart Jeppsson, Mikael Kallner, and others working in the detailed Silurian stratigraphy of Scandinavia and elsewhere, have spent decades reading the story out of the limestone and the graptolite shales, layer by careful layer. The organisms that suffered most were the ones whose fossils define the Silurian in the first place. Graptolites, colonial animals living in the open water, each colony a branching or feathery structure made of individual zooids connected in a common tube, drifting through the Silurian Sea in numbers that are difficult to imagine. They are the Silurians' signature fossils precisely because they were so abundant and so globally distributed. A graptolite found in Wales and a graptolite found in what is now Australia were often the same species because the ocean was their shared medium and they went where the current took them. Biostratigraphers use them as index fossils, precise markers for geological time, because their lineages evolved rapidly enough and spread widely enough to date the rock wherever they are found. The Mulde event is sometimes called the Big Crisis for graptolites, and the name captures something real. Graptolite diversity, already reduced by earlier stresses within the Silurian, collapsed sharply at the Mulde horizon. Many lineages that had persisted through the earlier part of the period did not come through this interval. The open ocean world that had sustained them shifted in ways their biology could not accommodate. Conodonts suffered as well. These are small, eel-like animals, jawless, soft-bodied, known almost entirely from the tiny, tooth-like phosphatic elements they left behind in the sediment when they died. Microfossils technically, but exquisitely, preserved and extraordinarily useful to the geologist reading a section of marine rock, because conodonts, like graptolites, evolved rapidly and spread widely, and their elements can be used to date the layer in which they are found with great precision. At the Mulde event, and again at the Lau event, conodont assemblages turned over sharply. Species that had been stable disappeared. New assemblages replaced them, and the transition is abrupt enough in the rock to mark the event clearly even where other fossil evidence is sparse. What caused these sudden perturbations in the middle of a period that was supposed to be quiet? The honest answer involves the carbon isotope excursions themselves, which are among the largest such swings in the entire Phanerozoic record. A large positive excursion in the carbon isotope ratio of marine carbonates records a major change in how carbon was being cycled through the ocean and atmosphere, a shift toward the burial of large amounts of organic carbon, which draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which can cool the climate, which can alter ocean circulation, which can tip shallow, warm, well-oxygenated marine shelves toward instability. The oscillation between warm and cool states, between oxygenated and stagnant water masses, between thriving open ocean communities and diminished ones, that is the picture the Silurian now presents, once you look closely enough at the chemistry of the rock. The Silurian was not a quiet greenhouse. It was a period in which the ocean convulsed repeatedly between states that its inhabitants had to endure or not endure. Some endured, some did not. The graptolites that came through the Mulde event were fewer in number and different in character from the ones that had entered it. The conodonts that continued into the Predoli and then into the Devonian were a different assemblage from the one that had flourished earlier. The recovery was real, but it was a recovery from something, and the something had been significant. The recognition of these events as genuine crises overturned what had been a relatively settled picture of the Silurian. That overturning happened gradually through the 1980s and 1990s and into the 2000s, as the carbon isotope records became more detailed and more globally replicated, and as the biostratigraphic turnover data accumulated from sections in Sweden, the Baltic, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. This is the truthful sense in which the Lau and Mulde events belong to a video called Things History Forgot. Not that historians suppressed them, but that science had not yet assembled the evidence to name them clearly when the textbooks were written, and the textbooks, once written, are slow to change. And already, underneath these two separate stories, the archaeocyathids in their Cambrian sea, the graptolites drifting in the disturbed Silurian water, a thread is beginning to surface. Not loudly, not yet as a conclusion, only as a pattern beginning to repeat with enough consistency to notice. Ocean anoxia, carbon cycle disruption. The possibility, in at least one of these cases, of volcanic forcing from beneath, the planet's interior pressing against the surface of life in ways that left their mark not in the catastrophic and sudden language of an asteroid impact, but in the slow, accumulating chemical language of the rock. The same machinery turning again. And so we come to the third of these forgotten pulses, the one that sits inside a story you may already half know. And that is precisely what makes it so easy to overlook. The late Devonian mass extinction is one of the big five. It has a place in the canon. It was there in the 1982 analysis that David Raup and Jack Sepkoski assembled from the marine fossil record, counted among the 5 great collapses that have punctuated the history of complex life on Earth. So in one sense it has never been forgotten at all. But what has been forgotten, or more precisely, what has never properly entered the public picture of it, is what the late Devonian extinction actually was on the inside, because it was not a single event. It was not a clean horizon in the rock, a sharp line you can press your fingertip against and say, here, on this side, the Devonian world was alive, and on the other side, it was not. The late Devonian extinction was a drawn-out, multipulse crisis that stretched across perhaps 20 million years, with different waves of dying separated by partial recoveries, by intervals of uneasy biological rebuilding, by stretches of time when life seemed to be finding its footing again before the next disturbance came. And buried at the heart of that long, complicated collapse is the event we are here to consider tonight. The Kellwasser crisis, the pulse that matters most, the one whose signature is clearest in the rock, the one that ended something so large and so beautiful that the world would not see its like again for over 100 million years. The Frasnian and Furmenian are the names of 2 geological stages within the late Devonian. They are not household words, but the boundary between them, laid down around 372 million years ago, is one of the more significant lines in the history of life on this planet. And the way we know it is significant is partly because of 2 layers of black rock in a mountain range in Germany. The Harz Mountains in what is now central Germany are not dramatic by alpine standards. They are old and worn, rounded by time, forested and quiet. But within their rock record, geologists examining the Frasnian-Furmenian boundary found something that tells a global story with unusual clarity. 2 thin layers, called the Lower Kellwasser Horizon and the Upper Kellwasser Horizon, composed of black, organic, rich shale, dark and dense with the preserved remains of organic material that did not decay. And the reason that organic material did not decay is the same reason the sea went dark in those layers in the first place. There was no oxygen to do the decaying. The water at depth had become anoxic, breathless, stagnant, chemically hostile to most forms of life. The black shale of the Kellwasser horizons is not simply a color, it is a record of suffocation, a record of ocean water turning against the creatures that lived within it. Ocean anoxia is a mechanism we have already met, turning up in the Silurian disturbances and suspected in the end Batonian crisis before that. But the scale of what happened at the Kellwasser crisis was larger than those earlier events, and what it destroyed was, in terms of sheer biological splendor, perhaps the single greatest loss in all of these forgotten extinctions. Because the Devonian world had built reefs. Not the coral reefs of our own era, though those are wondrous enough in their own right. The Devonian reef systems were different in their architecture and different in their builders, but comparable, and some paleontologists would say exceeding, in their scale and their complexity. They were constructed not by the stony corals that dominate reef ecosystems today, but by organisms called stromatoporoids, sponge-like creatures that built layered, calcified structures, and by two now extinct groups of coral, the tabulate corals and the rugose corals. The tabulate corals built honeycomb-like structures, each cell housing a small polyp. The rugose corals were often solitary, horn-shaped, though some built colonial masses. Together with the stromatoporoids, these organisms had spent tens of millions of Devonian years constructing enormous reef complexes that stretched across the warm, shallow tropical seas of the period. Barrier reefs, platform reefs, patch reefs, systems of accumulated carbonate rock that sheltered dense and intricate communities of marine life in much the same way that reef systems shelter biological communities today. The geologist Paul Copper spent much of his career studying these Devonian reefs, and what his work made clear is that the Devonian had something close to the largest reef systems in Earth's history. The warm, shallow epicontinental seas that covered much of what is now North America, Europe, and parts of Asia were ideal for reef growth, and the organisms that built those reefs took full advantage. The Devonian reef world was, in the language of paleontology, a carbonate factory of exceptional output, a global biological engineering project that had been under construction for tens of millions of years. The Kellwasser crisis ended it, not gradually, not in the way that a reef might slowly bleach and thin over decades of mild thermal stress. The Frasnian-Furmenian boundary records a collapse so severe that stromatoporoids, which had been major reef builders for over 100 million years, were effectively finished as a significant ecological force. The tabulate corals, which had likewise been building reefs since before the Devonian began, went almost entirely extinct. The rugose corals survived in diminished and altered form, but the great reef ecosystems they had helped construct were gone. And what replaced them in the Furmenian, and then through the long recovery that followed, was not reefs of comparable scale. Reefs of comparable scale would not exist again on this planet for more than 100 million years. That is not a modest statement. 100 million years is a span of time that encompasses the entire age of the dinosaurs twice over. The Devonian reef collapse was an erasure whose consequences echoed through geological time at a scale we have difficulty even conceptualizing. The tropical and warm water species were hit hardest. The Kellwasser crisis was not indiscriminate. It had a selectivity, a thermal signature. Cold water and high-latitude organisms already adapted to conditions that were in some ways harsher fared somewhat better. The creatures of the warm equatorial shallows, the animals that had built their lives and their bodies around stable, sunlit, oxygen-rich tropical water, were the ones the crisis targeted most ruthlessly. And this selectivity points to climate disruption layered on top of anoxia, not just the spreading of stagnant, oxygen-poor water from the deep, but a cooling of the global climate that would have made the warm tropical seas simultaneously colder and more chemically hostile. The two stresses were not separate stories, they were part of the same transformation. Now, what caused this? What turned the Devonian oceans anoxic? What drove the reef collapse? The answer that has attracted the most sustained scientific attention, the one most discussed in the work of researchers like Thomas Algeo and Scott Scheffler, is at once elegant and strange, the kind of answer that, when you hear it, makes you pause and reconsider the connections between the living world and the physical world in ways you might not have anticipated. The Devonian was also the period when plants conquered the land in earnest, not mosses and small ground-hugging vegetation, but true-rooted vascular plants, the ancestors of trees. And across the Middle and Late Devonian, these plants were doing something that had never happened before in the history of the Earth. They were growing large. They were evolving deep root systems, systems capable of penetrating rock, of pulling up minerals from beneath the soil, of holding the ground in ways that the thin mats of earlier land vegetation could not. By the Late Devonian, the first forests existed. Archaeopteris, which was among the most widespread of these early tree-like plants, could grow to 10 meters or more in height, with woody trunks and deep, spreading roots. The world's first forests were taking hold on the continents that bordered the warm Devonian seas, and those roots changed everything. Deep roots do something that shallow roots do not. They break rock. They penetrate fissures. They draw up nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, from the mineral substrate and release them through leaf fall and organic decay into the soil, and from there into streams and rivers, and eventually the sea. Before deep-rooted plants existed, the delivery of nutrients from continents into the ocean was a slower, more limited process. After deep-rooted plants evolved, the delivery of nutrients, particularly phosphorus, increased dramatically. Nutrients flowing into the coastal ocean mean one thing above all else: algal blooms. Vast, dense proliferations of microscopic algae feeding on the sudden abundance of phosphorus, growing explosively and then dying. And when they die and sink and begin to decompose, the decomposition consumes oxygen. In shallow coastal waters, dense enough bloom and intense enough decomposition, and you strip the oxygen from the water. You create anoxia. You create the conditions that the black Kellwasser shale records. This is the Algeo and Scheffler hypothesis, and it is one of the more haunting ideas in all of paleontology. The first forests helped kill the sea. Life on land, in the process of its own great expansion, inadvertently poisoned the shallow tropical oceans that life in the sea depended upon. The forests did not do this out of malice, of course. They were simply growing, as organisms do. But the consequence of their growth, the nutrient runoff, the eutrophication of coastal waters, the spread of anoxia, was one of the mechanisms that drove the Kellwasser crisis and the collapse of the Devonian reef world. The two great expansions of the Devonian, the reef systems in the sea and the forests on the land, were not simply parallel developments happening in separate spheres. They were entangled, and the entanglement in the end was lethal. This is, of course, a hypothesis, a well-supported and widely discussed one, grounded in geochemical evidence and in the timing of the forest expansion relative to the marine crisis, but a hypothesis nonetheless. The Kellwasser crisis likely had multiple contributing causes: global cooling, sea level change, possibly volcanic activity somewhere in the background. The precise weighting of these factors is still debated in the literature. But the forest eutrophication idea captures something true about the way the living world operates. The way that one part of the biosphere can alter another part in ways that are not immediately obvious. The way that the expansion of life in one domain can create conditions that contract life in another. And then, after the collapse, slowly, the world rebuilt itself. The Furmenian seas were quieter and less diverse than the Frasnian ones. The grand reef-building project that had defined the Devonian was over, but creatures survived. New lineages of fish continued to move through the changed oceans. The land plants that had helped trigger the crisis continued to spread and evolve. Life, as it always does, moved forward, different in composition, reduced in diversity for a time, but persistent. The Kelwasser crisis ended something large and beautiful, and out of that ending, the world that followed, a world moving toward the coal forests of the Carboniferous, toward the great swamps and giant amphibians and early reptiles, would have seemed to any observer like something new, because it was. There is a certain kind of thinking about the history of life that sees every extinction as pure loss, and there is loss in each of these events, genuine loss, the permanent ending of evolutionary experiments that had run for millions of years. But there is another way to hold these events in mind, a way that makes them easier to rest with. Every time the planet cleared the stage, whether through ocean anoxia or carbon cycle disruption or climate shift, the organisms that remained, the survivors who had adapted or been lucky or simply been in the right place, found themselves in a world with more room, more ecological space, more opportunity. The collapse of the Devonian reef world was an ending. It was also eventually a clearing. And what came after in the long Furmenian and then the Carboniferous was genuinely new. Not the same world restored, something the planet had not tried before. We will come back to that idea. It is the thread running through all 7 of these forgotten events, and it is becoming clearer with each one we examine. But there is a particular case still ahead of us tonight that makes this point with unusual vividness. An event where the clearing of the stage and the rise of something new are not separated by millions of years of recovery, but are in fact the same story, where the catastrophe and the flourishing are so closely linked in time and in causation that it is almost impossible to tell them apart. To find it, we move forward in time, past the end of the Devonian, past the Carboniferous with its great coal swamps, past the Permian and its double catastrophe, the Capitanian, which we examined earlier tonight, and then the great dying that followed 8 million years later. Past the end of the Permian and into the Triassic, where life spent tens of millions of years slowly rebuilding from the worst extinction in Earth's history. We move past the early Triassic's long recovery, past the diversification of the archosaurs, the broad reptilian group from which dinosaurs and crocodilians and pterosaurs would eventually emerge, and we arrive in the late Triassic, in a stage called the Carnian, around 234 million years ago, and here we encounter something that does not fit neatly into the usual vocabulary of extinction at all, something that is in some ways more remarkable than a simple catastrophe. Because what happened in the Carnian was not just that things died, it was that the planet, for somewhere between 1 and 2 million years, simply would not stop raining. Think about that for a moment. 1 million years, 2 million years. From our vantage point deep in the 21st century, we measure dramatic climate events in decades, perhaps in centuries. A sustained climate shift over thousands of years feels geological in scope. But the interval that researchers like Michael Sims and Alistair Ruffle identified in 1989, when they first recognized and named what they called the Carnian pluvial event, that interval ran for something in the order of 1 to 2 million years. And across that interval, in the rock record of regions that had been persistently arid, the red desert sandstones and evaporites that are the signatures of a dry, hot world, suddenly there appears wet. There appear the sedimentary signatures of sustained, heavy precipitation, mudstones that record standing water, channel deposits that record rivers. the geological evidence of a world where it was not a drought occasionally broken by rain, but rain that had become the overwhelming condition of the planet. This was not a gentle, pleasant increase in humidity. The Carnian world before the event had been warm and dry across much of the continental interior, as is typical of a late Triassic Earth with no large polar ice caps. What the Carnian pluvial event brought was a disruption of that established aridity, an intensification of the global water cycle, of evaporation from warm ocean surfaces and of precipitation on the land, that in the geological record looks like a dramatic and prolonged shift from one climatic state to another. And then, after perhaps 1 million or 2 million years, the aridity returned. The dry red beds came back. The rain stopped. The mechanism most widely discussed for this shift is the Wrangellia Large Igneous Province. The Wrangellia terrain is now preserved in fragments across western North America, in parts of Alaska, British Columbia, and the Pacific Northwest. But in the Carnian, the volcanism associated with it was active, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at rates that would have warmed the planet significantly. More heat in the climate system means more evaporation from ocean surfaces. More evaporation means more water vapor in the atmosphere. More water vapor means more rain. The Wrangellia volcanism, on this hypothesis, effectively supercharged the hydrological cycle of the Carnian world, producing the prolonged and intense rainy interval that Sims and Ruffel first identified in the geological record more than 3 decades ago, and in the carbon isotope record of Carnian sediments, in the ratio of heavier to lighter carbon preserved in the rocks. There are multiple negative excursions across the interval of the pluvial event. Negative carbon isotope excursions are the fingerprint of a large injection of isotopically light carbon into the Earth system. They are what you see in the rock when massive quantities of volcanic carbon dioxide, or sometimes methane, enter the atmosphere and ocean in a geologically brief period. The Carnian carbon isotope signal is not a single, clean excursion, but a more complex pattern of multiple swings which is consistent with the picture of sustained volcanic activity driving a prolonged climatic reorganization rather than a single brief pulse. This work has been developed and synthesized by researchers including Jacopo Dal Corso and his colleagues, and the review they published in Science Advances in 2020 drew together the global evidence for the event's timing, its causes, and its biological consequences in a way that made clear how significant the Carnian pluvial event actually was and how long it had been underappreciated, because the biological consequences were real. The Carnian pluvial event was not a purely climatic curiosity with no impact on the living world. In the marine realm, various groups turned over. Certain invertebrate communities were disrupted. Among the groups affected were marine organisms not often discussed in general accounts of extinction, and one set of survivors that responded to the changed conditions by expanding dramatically was the calcareous nanoplankton, tiny single-celled organisms that build their bodies from calcium carbonate and that would go on to become major players in the ocean's carbon cycle. Some of the earliest diversification of these organisms, which are the ancestors of the modern coccolithophores that still blanket the ocean surface today, is associated with the Carnian interval. A crisis for some was an opening for others. That is the recurring logic. On land, certain groups of conifer-like plants also appear to have undergone significant turnover and early modernization during the Carnian pluvial interval, contributing to the lineages that would eventually produce the modern conifers, the pines and spruces and firs and cypresses that still cover enormous areas of the terrestrial world. Dal Corso and colleagues note these connections, and while the precise causal chain between the rainy interval and the diversification of particular plant groups is not always easy to establish with certainty, the temporal association is suggestive. Disruption to existing ecosystems creates niches, and organisms capable of exploiting the new conditions inherit them. But the consequence of the Carnian pluvial event that matters most for the story of this planet, the consequence that once you know it, changes the way you think about one of the most famous chapters in the history of life, involves a group of organisms that were, in the Carnian, still relatively minor players in a world dominated by other reptiles, the dinosaurs. In the early and middle Triassic, in the long decades and centuries after the end Permian Great Dying, the world's ecosystems on land were recovering and reorganizing. The group of archosaurs from which dinosaurs would eventually descend was present, but dinosaurs themselves, the lineage that would come to dominate terrestrial ecosystems for the next 160 million years, appear in the fossil record as modest, not particularly diverse, not particularly widespread. Other reptiles, including various groups of crurotarsans and the ancestors of the crocodilians, occupied many of the ecological roles that dinosaurs would later fill. The Triassic world did not look, in its middle stages, like a world moving toward the age of dinosaurs. It looked like a world where dinosaurs were one option among many. What Massimo Bernardi and his colleagues documented in 2018 is that the timing of the dinosaurs' dramatic diversification and range expansion aligns closely with the Carnian pluvial event. Before the pluvial event, dinosaurs were geographically restricted and ecologically limited. After it, in the sediments immediately above the Carnian wet interval, in the late Triassic formations that follow it, the dinosaur fossil record changes. Suddenly, dinosaur footprints and skeletal material appear more widely across more continents, in more ecological contexts. The diversification that would eventually produce the sauropods and the theropods and all the remarkable lineages of the Mesozoic appears to have its roots, or at least a significant acceleration, in the aftermath of the Carnian pluvial event. Why would 1 million or 2 million years of rain help the dinosaurs? The mechanism is not entirely settled, but the broad logic is available. The pluvial event disrupted existing terrestrial ecosystems. Groups that had been well established and successful in the pre-Carnian arid world were stressed by the prolonged humidity, by the altered vegetation, by the changed food webs. Groups that were more ecologically flexible, or that had anatomical features suited to a wider range of environments, were better positioned to survive and expand when the disruption came. Dinosaurs, or at least the early lineages of dinosaurs, appear to have been among the organisms that benefited from this reorganization, not because they were invulnerable to the Carnian event, but because they were better adapted or luckier or more flexible. The precise reason remains an active area of research, and when the disruption ended and the world reorganized into its post-Carnian configuration, they were there to expand into the space that had opened up. And so the age of the dinosaurs, that great chapter in Earth's history that most people know through the lens of the Cretaceous, through Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and Brachiosaurus, through the asteroid that eventually ended it, has a quieter, less celebrated origin. It begins not with the dinosaurs themselves, but with 2 million years of rain, with a volcanic province called the Wrangellia burning carbon into the atmosphere, with the warming and the intensification of precipitation and the disruption of ecosystems that followed, with the extinction and the turnover and the reorganization that created the ecological space into which the dinosaurs expanded. The Carnian pluvial event is, in one sense, the opening act of the age of the dinosaurs, and it is an event that almost no one has heard of. This is the pattern becoming fully visible now with 4 of our 7 events behind us. 4 different moments in the history of life spread across more than 200 million years of geological time, and in 4 of them, in different proportions and different configurations, the same machinery is turning. Volcanism on a massive scale, from large igneous provinces whose names have changed and whose rocks now sit scattered across the altered continents. The Kalkarinji in what is now Australia, the Amatian in what is now Sichuan and Yunnan in China, and now the Wrangellia in fragments along the Pacific margin of North America. Each of them pumped carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in volumes and over timescales that overwhelmed the Earth system's ordinary capacity to absorb and buffer the change. Each of them altered the climate, warming, disrupting, shifting rainfall and circulation and ocean chemistry in ways that reorganized the living world. And several of those reorganizations ran through the same secondary mechanism, ocean anoxia. The warming reduces the solubility of oxygen in seawater. The altered circulation creates stagnant zones where oxygen cannot be replenished. The biological productivity changes, sometimes algal blooms consuming oxygen in decomposition, as in the Devonian. And the result is a spreading deadness in the deep ocean and the shallow sea alike. Not a rapid, violent death, but a slow chemical smothering recorded afterward in layers of black, organic-rich shale wherever the dead zones reached. The Kellwasser horizons in the Harz Mountains, the anoxic sediments of the End-Batomian Sea, the black shales that record the Silurian disturbances, layer after layer in the rock, each one a record of water running out of breath. The planet has a recurring habit. That is what these events are showing one by one. Not a random collection of disasters, each unique and disconnected, but the expression of a single underlying tendency in the Earth system. The tendency for the geological interior to periodically intrude upon the surface world with enough force to change the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean, and through that chemistry to change the composition of life. Again and again through the long history recorded in the rock, that intrusion has happened. And again life has absorbed the blow and rebuilt, differently, in new configurations, with new organisms in the ecological roles that the old ones vacated, but rebuilt nonetheless. We have not yet finished the list. There are 3 more events to examine before the night is through. 3 more forgotten extinctions waiting in the rock, each one carrying its own particular character, its own mechanism, its own story of what was lost and what eventually arose to take its place. The machinery is named now, the pattern is visible, and what remains is to trace it 2 more times into intervals of deep time that are, in their own ways, among the most important in the history of life on this planet. But first, allow yourself to settle a little more deeply into whatever surface is holding you tonight. The weight of 372 million years of Devonian ocean, the color of the Kellwasser shale, the sound of 2 million years of Carnian rain. These are not things that demand alertness. They are things that invite a kind of quiet surrender to the scale of time, to the patience of the rock, to the extraordinary fact that any of this is recoverable at all from the stone of old mountains and the careful measurements of people who devoted their working lives to reading what the layers say. The Earth kept records, and the records, read slowly and without haste, tell a story that is not frightening in the way that disaster might seem frightening from close up, but that is, from the distance of deep time, something closer to the rhythm of breath. A long exhale, a long pause, and then in time, the inhale of something new. The 6th event on this list stands apart from the others in one particular way. The first 5, the Capitanian, the End-Batomian, the Silurian Lau and Muldi events, the Kellwasser crisis, the Carnian pluvial event, all belong to that remote and almost unimaginable span of time before the dinosaurs rose and fell, before the mammals inherited the warm Mesozoic world, before the continents had arranged themselves into anything resembling their current positions. They happened in intervals so deep that the very rock containing them has been folded and uplifted and eroded into mountain ranges, carried across ocean floors, subducted back into the mantle and reborn as new stone entirely. They belong to a world that requires real effort of the imagination to enter, a world where the creatures were genuinely alien to anything alive today. The 6th event is different. It happened in the Jurassic, which is old. around 183 million years ago in the early part of that period. But it is Jurassic old, which is to say that if you have seen a museum reconstruction of a long-necked sauropod dinosaur, a tall sailed diplodocus, a stegosaurus with its row of plates along the spine, you have already begun to inhabit the general neighborhood of this event, however distantly. Ammonites were swimming in the Jurassic seas, ichthyosaurs were swimming with them. The world was warm and mostly free of polar ice, and the shallow continental seas that had spread across large parts of the land masses were teeming with the kind of organized, recognizable marine life that, if you had a submarine capable of traveling backward through time, would not strike you as utterly incomprehensible. And then the ocean stopped breathing. This is the torsion oceanic anoxic event, called in the shorthand of the people who study it, the TOAE. It is sometimes also called the Jenkins event, after the geologist who did foundational work on describing and naming it. It happened during the Torsian Age, which is a subdivision of the early Jurassic. And what happened was this. In ocean basins across the world, the oxygen that normally circulates through the water column and reaches the seafloor was stripped away. The water became, in geological terms, anoxic, breathless. And the creatures that lived on and near the bottom of those seas, the ones that required oxygen to respire the way you do right now, simply suffocated. The evidence for this event is recorded, as it so often is in this story, in the color of the rock. When ocean water is oxygenated, the sediment that accumulates on the seafloor is typically worked over by burrowing organisms, worms, crustaceans, small animals, whose activity mixes the sediment and disrupts the fine layering that would otherwise form. But when the oxygen is gone, those burrowers are gone too, and the sediment falls undisturbed, layer by laminar layer, preserving its structure perfectly. It also accumulates the organic material, the dead algae, the dead zooplankton, the organic carbon that would normally be consumed by aerobic bacteria, because without oxygen, the decomposers that would break it down cannot function either. The result is a dark rock, dense with organic carbon, laminated in thin bands like the pages of a book, black against the lighter sediments that sandwich it. This dark layer appears in exposures of Jurassic rock across Europe, North Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific margins of the ancient world. It is one of the most recognizable and widely studied layers in the entire Mesozoic rock record. The carbon chemistry of this layer is equally remarkable. When geochemists measure the isotopic signature of carbon preserved in organic material and in carbonate rocks across the TOAE interval, they find one of the most pronounced negative excursions in the carbon isotope record anywhere in the Mesozoic. A sharp shift toward isotopically lighter carbon, the kind of carbon that comes from organic sources rather than from seawater or air. What this shift means is that an enormous quantity of isotopically light carbon entered the ocean and atmosphere system in a geologically very brief interval. This is the fingerprint of a massive carbon release event. Carbon injected into the world's oceans and air faster than the natural carbon cycle could absorb and buffer it. The work of Stephen Hesselbo and colleagues, published in Nature in the year 2000, helped establish the scale and significance of this excursion, and it remains one of the defining measurements in Toarcian research. Where did the carbon come from? There are two candidates, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is volcanism, specifically the Karoo-Ferrar Large Igneous Province, a massive eruption system whose products are preserved today in what is now southern Africa and in Antarctica. The Karoo-Ferrar is one of the genuinely enormous volcanic events in Earth's history, erupting over an interval that overlaps closely with the TOAE, and its emissions of carbon dioxide would have been substantial. Think of it in the terms we have used before in this account, a province of volcanic fissures opening across a continent, breathing out carbon dioxide not in the explosive plume of a single catastrophic eruption, but steadily over tens of thousands of years, pushing the greenhouse effect of the entire planet upward by degrees. The planet warms, the ocean surface warms, and warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water, the way a cold glass holds its fizz longer than a warm one. So the warming alone begins to reduce the oxygen available to the deep ocean. The second candidate is something more unusual and in some ways more unsettling in the slow atmospheric way of this kind of story. On the floors of the world's continental shelves and ocean margins, there exist today, and existed far more abundantly in the early Jurassic, accumulations of methane hydrates. These are a form of methane ice, frozen natural gas, trapped within a crystalline lattice of water molecules, stable under the conditions of cold temperature and high pressure that prevail in certain seafloor environments. They are, in a sense, a vast cold reservoir of carbon, sitting quietly in the dark beneath the seafloor mud. And they are sensitive to temperature. If the deep ocean warms past a threshold, the hydrate lattice can destabilize, and the methane locked within it bubbles free into the water column and ultimately into the atmosphere. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and its release would amplify the warming already underway, which would destabilize more hydrates, which would release more methane. A feedback mechanism that geologists describe with the careful language of hypothesis and strong association rather than settled certainty, but that the carbon isotope record of the TOAE is consistent with in ways that have attracted sustained scientific attention. The organisms that suffered under these conditions were the ones you might expect from an ocean losing its oxygen and warming its surface. Ammonites, those beautiful coiled shells that are among the most recognizable fossils of the Mesozoic, the ones you can find in certain limestone exposures in England and Germany, shaped like ram's horns or nautilus spirals or flat watch springs, were hit hard. Bivalves, the clams and oysters and their relatives that had colonized the seafloor, found that the bottom habitats they depended on were increasingly dead zones, the sediment laminated and airless. The bottom-dwelling communities of the shallow Jurassic seas, the whole organized ecology of burrowers and filter feeders and scavengers that had built itself up across the floor, were suffocated wherever the anoxia spread. In the most affected basins, the seafloor was simply lethal, and the record of benthic life drops to near zero across the black shale interval. And then, after what the rock suggests was a geologically brief interval, tens of thousands of years, perhaps a few 100,000 at the outside, the oxygen came back, unevenly, in patches, and the benthic communities began to re-establish themselves, and the ammonites that had survived in less affected ocean regions expanded back into the basins that had been cleared. The black shale gives way upward to lighter, more bioturbated sediment, the burrow marks of returning worms and crustaceans visible as a kind of biological signature of recovery. There is one additional thing worth saying about the torsion oceanic anoxic event, and it is this. The scientists who study it today do not study it only for its own sake, as a finished episode in the deep past. They study it because the combination of mechanisms it displays, volcanic carbon release, ocean warming, loss of dissolved oxygen in the water column, changes in seawater chemistry, stress on carbonate-secreting organisms, is a combination that the world is currently reproducing through different means and at different rates in the present day. The TOAE is treated in the scientific literature as a deep time analog, a case study in what happens to ocean chemistry and ocean ecosystems when large quantities of carbon enter the system rapidly and the ocean warms and loses its oxygen. It is a precautionary tale written in 183-million-year-old rock, and the people who read it most carefully are, in part, the ones most interested in the future. That point does not need to be belabored here, in the quiet of this particular hour. It is enough to say it once and let it sit. The Earth has been here before. The rocks remember, And the recovery, when it came, took time, but it came. The seventh and final event on this list is perhaps the most elegant in its naming, and in some ways the closest to the kind of world that feels recognizable without having to stretch the imagination too far across the abyss of time. It is called the Grande Coupure. In French, this means, roughly, the Great Break or the Great Cut, and it is an old name. Older than most of the names on this list, which were coined in the 1980s or 1990s or the first years of this century. The name was given by a Swiss paleontologist named Hans Georg Stehlin, and he gave it in the year 1910. Stehlin was examining the fossil mammal record of European rock formations, working through the systematics of the creatures preserved in sediments from the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, and what he found was a boundary so sharp, a change in the fauna so complete and so sudden in geological terms, that it demanded a name. Something had happened. The mammals that existed in Europe before this line were not the same as the mammals that existed in Europe after it. The turnover was deep, and it was real, and it was, to Stehlin's eye, as clean a break as the rock record ever shows for a period that did not involve something as dramatic as a meteor impact or an eruption of continental-scale volcanic rock. The Grande Coupure falls at, or very close to, the boundary between the Eocene and the Oligocene epochs, around 34 million years ago, which puts it in a span of time where the mammals of the world were already well established, already diversified, already occupying ecological roles that would be recognizable in broad outline, even if the specific animals would look strange and unfamiliar in their details. The world of the late Eocene was warm. It was a greenhouse world, a world without permanent polar ice sheets, a world in which warm, shallow seas penetrated far into the continental interiors and subtropical vegetation grew in latitudes that today support temperate forests. The ancestors of horses, rhinoceroses and tapirs were wandering the northern hemisphere. The whales had only recently moved from land to sea. Primates were widespread across both the old and new worlds. It was a world deep in the long warmth of the post-dinosaur hothouse, a world that had been warm and wet and biologically generous for tens of millions of years. And then, around 34 million years ago, the temperature fell. This is the Eocene-Oligocene transition, and it is, in the oxygen isotope record of deep-sea sediments, one of the most dramatic cooling steps in the Cenozoic, which is the era of mammal dominance that began when the dinosaurs ended and has continued to the present day. The world moved from greenhouse to icehouse. Permanent ice sheets formed on Antarctica for the first time in tens of millions of years, the first really substantial continent-spanning glaciation of the southern continent. Sea levels fell as water was locked into ice. The climate of the northern hemisphere became markedly cooler and drier. The subtropical forests of Europe began to give way to more open, seasonal landscapes, and in that changed and cooling world, the mammal communities of Europe underwent a transformation so thorough that Stehlin, examining it 116 years ago from bones in museum drawers, could see it as a break without needing to understand all the mechanisms behind it. The archaic mammal groups that had inhabited Europe through the Eocene were replaced. Many of them did not survive the cooler, drier conditions. They went extinct at or near the boundary, their lineages closing out in the fossil record. But what makes the Grande Coupure particularly interesting, and what gives it a character somewhat different from the other events on this list, is that the turnover was not only a matter of extinction, it was also a matter of invasion. As sea levels fell during the cooling, land connections that had previously been flooded by shallow seas opened up, creating corridors between land masses that had been separated by water. And across these newly opened corridors, mammals from Asia moved westward into Europe, filling the ecological spaces that the vanishing Eocene groups had left behind. The result was a Europe remade, not quite emptied, but profoundly reorganized. The familiar Eocene caste largely gone, replaced by immigrants from the East, whose lineages had evolved under different conditions and who now found themselves inheriting a continent that had been cleared for them by a combination of climate stress and the simple opening of a doorway they had not previously had access to. This combination of extinction and immigration, both driven by the underlying shift in climate, is what gives the Grande Coupure its particular texture as an event. It is not simply a dying, it is a replacement, a faunal exchange, a wholesale remodeling of who lives where and why. A parallel pattern unfolded in North America across roughly the same interval. The White River fauna, as geologists call the assemblage of fossil mammals from the North American Oligocene, records a significant turnover in the continent's mammal communities during and after the Eocene-Oligocene transition. The archaic forms that had dominated the Eocene gave way to new assemblages better adapted to the cooler and more open landscapes that the cooling climate was creating. The details differ from the European story. There was no comparable Asian immigration event, for one thing, because the geography of the North Atlantic and Pacific did not provide the same kind of newly opened corridors. But the underlying driver was the same: a planet cooling, environments shifting, and animals either adapting, moving, or disappearing. Why did the world cool so sharply at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary? Here, as with all these events, the honest answer is that the science points to a convergence of factors rather than a single cause. The opening of ocean gateways around Antarctica, the Drake Passage between South America and Antarctica, and the Tasmanian Gateway between Australia and Antarctica, is frequently cited as a major contributor. When these gateways opened fully, they allowed the formation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a deep and powerful ocean current that circled the southern continent and thermally isolated it from the warmer ocean waters to the north. Without warm water reaching Antarctica, the continent's ice sheets could grow and stabilize. Atmospheric carbon dioxide was also declining during this interval, reducing the greenhouse effect and contributing to the cooling. And there is one more factor that sits in the record, more contested and more dramatic in its implications. Two large impact craters, the Popigai crater in Siberia and the Chesapeake Bay crater on the eastern seaboard of North America, both date to within a few million years of the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. Whether these impacts played a meaningful role in the cooling and the biotic turnover, or whether their timing is broadly coincidental with climate drivers that would have operated regardless, is a question that has not been fully settled. The craters are real, the timing is close, the causal connection is contested, and that word, contested, is the appropriate one to use when the evidence is genuine but the interpretation is not. What is not contested is the result. A world that had been warm for a very long time became cold, and the organisms that had built their lives around the warmth were reorganized by the cold. The Grande Coupure, with its graceful French name and its century-old history as a recognized boundary in the fossil record, is the mark that reorganization left in the European stone. It is, in its way, the most recent of the events on this list, recent enough that the mammals involved would not have seemed entirely alien if you could have seen them in life, recent enough that the world they inhabited had continents in roughly their modern positions, recent enough that the cooling that drove the event is the same long cooling trend that eventually produced the Pleistocene ice ages, the glaciers, and the world that our own species walked out into. 7 events, 7 forgotten extinctions, 7 entries on a list that runs from 517 million years ago to 34 million years ago, from the early Cambrian to the late Cenozoic, from the first sponge-like reefs of the archaeocyathids to the warm climate mammals of the European Eocene. Each one has a name, most of them coined in the last 50 years. Each one has a mechanism or a cluster of suspected mechanisms that the rock records in chemistry and color and the presence or absence of certain fossils in certain layers. Each one reshaped, in its own particular way, the living world that came after it. And here, at the end of the list, the pattern that has been quietly accumulating across all 7 entries becomes something you can hold in a single thought. The Big Five, the events that Sepkoski and Raup named in 1982, the ones that appear in the textbooks and the popular accounts and the museum displays, are the headlines. They are the events so large that they could not be missed, so catastrophic that the record of their passing is visible even in a cursory reading of the fossil record. But the 7 events on this list, the ones that science has named more recently or recognized more fully, or separated out from the confusion of the larger events that surrounded them, are the footnotes. And footnotes, read carefully, often contain the real argument. The real argument here is not that the Earth is a dangerous place, or that extinction is the norm, or that everything dies eventually. The real argument is something quieter and more precise than that. It is this. Again and again across the full length of the fossil record, it has been the slow machinery of the planet itself. Not the sudden drama of an asteroid, but the patient, grinding work of volcanic provinces breathing carbon into the air, of oceans losing their oxygen, of climates sliding from greenhouse to icehouse and back, that has reshuffled the living world. The mechanism is not catastrophe from outside, it is geology from within. The planet, in its own geological time, occasionally reorganizes itself, and life reorganizes along with it. And each reorganization was, eventually, a beginning. The Archaeochaetid reefs ended in the early Cambrian, and in their place, over the subsequent millions of years, new kinds of reef builders would arise, eventually building reef systems on a scale the Archaeochaetids could never have achieved. The Silurian graptolites that vanished in the Mulder and Lau events were replaced by the diversifying fish of the Devonian, by the first jawless and then jawed vertebrates that were beginning in those warm Silurian and Devonian seas, the long line that leads eventually to every vertebrate alive today. The reef systems of the Devonian, collapsed by the Kelwasser crisis, would eventually be rebuilt slowly over the long recovery of the Carboniferous and Permian, and rebuilt by different organisms in different configurations. The 2 million years of Carnian rain cleared ecological space and dried it differently when the rain stopped, and into that altered world the dinosaurs stepped, expanding, diversifying, beginning the great evolutionary elaboration that would make them the dominant vertebrates of the Mesozoic. The breathless oceans of the Torsian filled again with ammonites and bivalves, and the slow return of benthic communities, the black shale sealed beneath the lighter sediments of recovery. The warm world of the Eocene gave way to the cooling of the Oligocene, and in that cooling, the mammals of Europe were remade. New lineages from Asia moving into the spaces the old ones had left, building new communities adapted to the new climate, the ancestors of the animals that would eventually, much later, share a world with our own kind. This is what the planet does. It breathes, it changes its chemistry, its temperature, its ocean circulation, and when it does, the organisms living on and in it are reorganized. Some lineages close, others, perhaps small and marginal and overlooked in the world that preceded the change, find that the change has opened a door for them, and they walk through it. None of these events were recorded by any consciousness. None had witnesses in any meaningful sense. They are recoverable only because certain organisms secreted shells of calcite or chitin or silica, and those shells fell to the seafloor, and the seafloor became rock, and the rock was uplifted and exposed by later geological processes, and people, patient, careful people with thin section microscopes and mass spectrometers and access to the deep literature of stratigraphy and biogeochemistry read what the rock said. Sepkoski compiled a compendium of marine genera. Raup analyzed the statistics. Stehlin compared mammal teeth in museum drawers in Basel in 1910 and gave the break he found a name in French. Jenkins described the black shale. Hesselbo measured the carbon isotopes. Dal Corso and Bernardi traced the connection between the Carnian rain and the dinosaurs. A community of people working across decades and in different countries and on different rock formations assembled piece by piece the story of events that no human being was alive to witness, events so old that the very rock containing them has been through geological transformations our own civilization has not even begun to experience. It is a remarkable thing. The stone records what happened. The records are patient, and the people who read them are part of a long, slow act of recovery, not of the ecosystems themselves, which recovered on their own in geological time, but of the memory of what occurred. You have tonight traveled from the early Cambrian to the late Cenozoic. You have visited 7 events that the popular accounts almost never name, and you have heard for each one what died and what eventually replaced it, what the rock records and what it does not, and what the scientists who study these intervals have carefully inferred from the evidence available to them. The pattern is there, if you have been following it, the same slow machinery, the same recurring villain in its various geological costumes, the same eventual recovery, the same opening of new possibilities in the wake of the old world's reorganization. The Earth has ended worlds far more often than the textbooks admit, and each ending was also, in time, a beginning. If this kind of slow journey through deep time is something that helps you find your way to sleep, if the weight of 500 million years of fossil record, the sound of the Tautian Ocean going breathless, the image of Stehlin in 1910 turning a mammal tooth in the light of a Basel museum and reaching for the right French words to describe a break he could see but not yet fully explain. If these things have given your mind something large and quiet to rest inside, then there are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind waiting for whenever the night calls for them. And if you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. There is something in knowing that someone in one part of the world and someone in another part of the world and someone in a third place, still undisclosed, all drifted towards sleep inside the same long account of forgotten extinctions. Something that makes the vast and lonely subject of deep time feel for a moment communal. So if you know where you are and feel like saying so, say so. You have done enough for one night. The Cambrian is behind you, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Eocene, all behind you now, all sealed in their respective rock, all quietly recorded in the stone of mountains you will never visit, waiting patiently for the next person who wants to read what they say. The archaeocyathids built their reefs, and the reefs ended and something else arose. The graptolites floated in the Silurian Sea, and then they did not, and the sea filled again. The forests grew roots into the Devonian soil, and the roots changed the chemistry of the rivers, and the rivers changed the chemistry of the sea, and the sea, for a time, went dark. The rain fell for 2 million Carnian years. The Jurassic Ocean lost its breath and found it again, and the warm Eocene world gave way to the first ice on Antarctica, to the chill that remade the mammals, to the long cooling that eventually made something like our own world possible. Let the deep thoughts settle and let yourself sink with them. Good night. Sleep well.